Now, moving on to the depths of the ocean from the expanses of space. Bizarre as it may sound, the UK's Royal Navy is hiring for a Rear Admiral through LinkedIn. The Navy has been forced to recruit for its top job through the professional networking platform, as it faces a recruitment crisis and is unable to fill the role internally. This is how the Royal Navy advertised for the role on LinkedIn. The post says the Navy is recruiting for a director of submarines who will be responsible for highly classified stealth, overseeing elite operations and Trident nuclear deterrent. The advertisement says candidates must be a member of the reserves or have previously served in the regular forces. The position commands a hefty £150,000 annual salary. Now, usually, senior officers are promoted to such ranks based on their merit. However, the UK Navy finds itself in the wake of a serious staffing crisis. It is struggling with a lack of sufficient sailors. Those in uniform are either ineligible or are not interested in the auspicious role. Now, this has had dire consequences. Reports say that the UK Navy recently decommissioned 2 of its warships due to a shortage of sailors. Now, these ships are the refurbished HMS Westminster and HMS Argyle. The refits had cost millions in taxpayer money. Earlier, UK's former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace warned that the country's armed forces were facing a recruitment crisis because Gen Z was not signing up. He said Royal Navy is experiencing a collapse in the number of recruits. Official data revealed that in 2022, the number leaving the Navy rose by 16.4%, while the number joining fell by 19.7%. Senior officials have reacted to the Navy's LinkedIn post. Some have called it utterly shameful, while some have said that it was unprecedented to advertise for such a critical post in this way. Now, for more on this, we're being joined by Professor David Dunn, the Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham. Thank you for being with us, Professor. Now, the UK's Royal Navy is hiring for a Rear Admiral through LinkedIn. Why is this the case, and does this highlight the staffing crisis in the UK?
I think there are 2 separate points here. The LinkedIn advert was not the only way they were recruiting. They were using that particular platform as a way to publicize the availability of this post, because the initial round of applications was fairly thin. But it does signal that the Royal Navy in particular and the armed forces in general are having a problem recruiting members at all ranks, but particularly as recruit level. And this is to do with the fact that Brexit has tightened the labour market in the United Kingdom. There are not lots of young people coming across from Europe filling jobs, creating opportunities for British people to join the armed forces. It's also that 50% of 18-year-olds now go to university in the UK, so there's a much less reduced pool of people to join the armed forces at 18 or 20 or 21. And then, because of the period of 20 years of peace, the Gen Z generation, or Gen Z generation, are not interested in the armed forces in the same way that previous generations of recruits were interested in joining the armed forces as a career. And this is something we see across Europe, the United States, and Australia. Australia are trying to increase the size of their armed forces, and they've come to the conclusion that they must pay much more to the members of their armed forces in order to recruit in tight labour markets to fill those spaces. So it's a generalised problem, and it's the one that applies to the Royal Navy in particular, because this generation doesn't like being isolated from social media and their friends by serving long times at sea, and therefore the Navy in particular, more than the Army and the Air Force, finds it difficult to fill its posts.
Right. Now, Professor, you spoke about some of those numbers as the data had revealed. There was a 19.7% collapse or fall of people from Gen Z across the board not joining. Why are we seeing such high numbers, especially with Gen Z, not signing up to join the Royal Navy?
I say it's partly the internet age, it's partly the connectivity, because, for example, the submarines force, they can spend up to 6 months at sea having no contact with their family or friends or any social media. And this generation that can't spend 5 minutes without looking at their phone find that very difficult to do. It's partly that actually there are many other opportunities that are better paid than the armed forces. So young people leaving university or leaving school at 18 now have a much wider range of things to do. And the armed forces aren't competitive in terms of the pay that they offer to this generation. And also actually the sensibility of this generation. They're more concerned about environmental questions rather than national security concerns, partly because they've grown up in a period of peace until, of course, very recently with the war in Ukraine. But actually their sensibility is one which is not necessarily aligned to the armed forces, nor do they like necessarily obeying orders and the disciplined, regimented lifestyle of the armed forces, because they've been brought up in a slightly softer approach to the way in which education and hierarchies operate. So for a whole variety of demographic and sociological reasons, they're less well disposed to join the armed forces than previous generations have been.
Now, Professor, the Navy recently decommissioned 2 of its warships due to a shortage of sailors. What could be the impact of this on the Royal Navy?
The decommissioning of those 2 vessels you mentioned is something which is planned, hasn't yet happened. And what they've said is when the new Type 26 frigates come into service, they will move the crews from the old ones to the new ones. And there is an issue there in terms of actually there was a plan to keep all those ships in service. But the priority is using the trained crews for the new, better, more capable frigates rather than the old ones. But there is an issue there in terms of actually the ability of the Royal Navy to mount as many patrols with warships as a consequence of that recruitment shortfall. So I think that the government needs to, and I imagine it will, address this by actually offering more money, as I say, like Australia planned to do, to actually pay the recruits a better salary and make it more attractive, and address this shortfall in the long term. But in the short term, there is a situation whereby perfectly capable ships will be sitting idle as a consequence of them being unable to be manned. So it is a problem. It's a problem particularly for the Royal Navy, but I say it's a problem that all Western armed forces are facing and need to address by more competitive packages for how they pay their sailors, soldiers and airmen.
Absolutely. Professor Dunn, thank you very much for being with us on this broadcast and all your valued insights there.
Always a pleasure.